Her name was Lena, 3 years old, dark hair that curled behind her ears. A laugh that started silent before it became loud, that particular sequence that meant something had genuinely caught her off guard and delighted her. She collected small, smooth stones from every station we docked at and kept them in a blue pouch that she checked every morning to make sure none were missing. She was taken on a Thursday night while I was running a late cargo check on the lower deck of our transport vessel, and my wife Suri was sleeping in the station docking arm we were berthed at on Karath 4 had a security gap that someone had known about and planned around carefully. By the time I got back to our quarters, Lena was gone, and Suri was awake, and the station's security response was already 6 minutes behind the people who had taken my daughter. I want to describe what that moment felt like, but I do not have language for it. I do not think language exists for it. There is a version of fear that goes past fear into something that is not panic and not grief and not rage, but contains all three and sits underneath all three and drives everything that follows with a clarity that is almost mechanical. I was operating in that clarity within 4 minutes of understanding what had happened. I did not wait for station security to tell me what they were doing. I asked them what they had, and they told me. Partial sensor footage from 2 docking arm cameras, a vessel registry that did not match any known traffic, a departure vector into the outer corridor that had been filed under a false manifest. I took copies of everything they had and I went to work. Suri stayed with the coalition liaison. Someone needed to handle the official process, and she was better at official processes than I was, and we both knew without saying it that I was not going to be useful in a coordination room. I was useful in a different way. 14 years of running cargo through the outer belt had given me things that station security databases did not have. Not formal intelligence. The informal kind. The network of contacts and counterattacks that builds up over a decade and a half of working in places where the official infrastructure was thin and the unofficial one was everything. I knew people on 11 stations in the outer corridor. Not allies. Not friends, most of them. People who owed me favors or whom I had done business with or who talked when the right question was asked in the right way. I started making calls. The vessel registry from the sensor footage was false, but false registries have patterns if you know what to look for. And I had spent 14 years looking at vessel documentation. The registry format was consistent with a specific modification style used by a particular class of outer corridor operator that worked the gap between the Harath system and the Dravosi corridor. Not raiders, traffickers. A different kind of operation, with different patterns and different infrastructure. I knew someone in the Dravosi corridor who knew that infrastructure. His name was Kalev, and he was not a good person, and he owed me a favor from 3 years ago that he had been hoping I would never collect. I collected it. He did not give me a name immediately. He gave me a station. A waypoint stop in the outer Dravosi corridor where vessels moving certain kinds of cargo made scheduled stops. He said, if the vessel I was looking for was running that corridor, it would hit that waypoint within 48 hours. I was at that station in 31 hours. I did not go to station security. Station security on outer corridor waypoints was either thin or compromised or both, and I did not have time to find out which. I went to the docking registry. The docking registry on a waypoint station was public record. Every vessel, every berth, every timestamp. I read 4 days of registry entries against the vessel profile I had built from the sensor footage and the registry format and the departure vector, and 14 years of knowing what cargo vessels looked like when they were trying not to be noticed. There were 3 candidates. I watched all 3 for 6 hours. One was a legitimate courier with documentation that checked out under direct observation. One had left 2 hours before I arrived. One was still berthed on the eastern arm. I watched the eastern arm vessel for 2 hours before I saw something. A crew member coming back from the station market with supplies. The specific supplies. Not crew food. Small items. The kind of items that meant there was a child somewhere on that vessel. I went back to Kalev. I told him what I had found, and I told him I needed one more thing. He said he was done with favors. I said I was not asking for a favor. I said I was telling him that a trafficking operation was running through infrastructure he was connected to, and that when the coalition came for that operation, which they would, the question of who had helped me find it and who had not was going to matter a great deal. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a call. The call was to someone who made another call, and 40 minutes later, I had a name and a manifest, and confirmation that there was a child matching Lena's description on the vessel, berthed on the eastern arm. I sent everything I had to the coalition liaison that Suri was working with. Then I sent it directly to the Outer Belt Coalition Rapid Response Coordinator with a message that said I had a located vessel, confirmed child, eastern arm berth 7, waypoint station Dravosi 4. and that I needed a response team, and under 3 hours before that vessel filed a departure. The Cordina. Tor responded in 11 minutes. She said a response team was being diverted from a patrol in the adjacent corridor. She said estimated arrival 2 hours 40 minutes. She said do not approach the vessel. I said understood. I watched berth 7 from a position on the upper docking level for 2 hours and 38 minutes. The response team arrived with 2 minutes to spare before the vessel's filed departure window. I will not describe the next 40 minutes in detail because some of it is in a coalition report that I am not supposed to discuss, and some of it I do not want to put into words because the words would not be adequate. Lena was on the vessel. She was not harmed. She still had the blue pouch. She was missing 2 stones, and when I held her in the docking bay of a waypoint station in the outer Dravosi corridor, she told me about the missing stones first before she told me anything else. And I told her we would find new ones, and she said they needed to be smooth, and I said they would be smooth, and she said promise, and I said, I promise. Surrey arrived on the next available transit, 18 hours later. We sat in a coalition family room on the waypoint station, and Lena slept between us with the blue pouch in her hand, and Surrey looked at me across our daughter's sleeping face. She said, how? I said 14 years of knowing the right people badly enough. She looked at me. I said I knew the infrastructure they used. I knew the patterns. I knew who to ask, and what to offer, and when to push. She said, you did this in 4 days. I said 3 days and some hours. She said the coalition has been looking. I said the coalition looks with official tools in official places. The people who took Lena do not move in official places. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at Lena sleeping. She said you were not supposed to approach the vessel. I said I did not approach the vessel. Sell, she said, but you would have. I looked at her. I said if the response team had not arrived. She said, yes. I said yes. She held my gaze. She said, I know. She said quietly. We sat there in the quiet room with our daughter sleeping between us, and outside the waypoint station, the outer corridor ran through the dark the way it always did, and inside that room everything was different from how it had been 4 days ago. And also exactly the same in the way that mattered most. The coalition coordinator found me the next morning before our departure. Her name was Dara, Valdorian, sharp and direct, the kind of officer who had seen a great many things and processed them quickly. She said the vessel crew was in custody. She said the network they were connected to was under active investigation. She said my intelligence on the infrastructure had been extremely useful. I said good. She looked at me for a moment. She said you built that intelligence in 3 days from a false vessel registry and a favor from a Dravosi corridor contact. I said I had the right starting points. She said most people in your situation contact the coalition and wait. I said waiting was not something I was able to do. She said no. She said, I can see that. She said human parents. She said slowly. The assessment profiles mention elevated protective response, but I do not think elevated is the right word. I said what word would you use? She thought about it. She said, absolute, she said. Like there is no version of the situation where you stop. I said there is not. She looked at me with those sharp Valdorian eyes. She said, I believe you. She left and I went back to our berth where Suri was packing, and Lena was arranging her remaining stones on the bunk in an order that made sense only to her. She held up a pale gray one. She said, this is the best one. I said it is a very good one. She said, can we find more? Today. I said we have a ship to catch. She said tomorrow. I said tomorrow we find more stones. She went back to her arranging. I watched her for a moment. Then I helped her pack them carefully back into the blue pouch, one by one, making sure none were missing.